Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about the movie The King of Staten Island and what this Catholic priest thinks about it. So I just recently saw the movie The King of Staten Island, and I want to talk about a few themes in it which I think are really, really important and really useful and helpful. A little background on the movie. It stars Pete Davidson, who plays a young man growing up in Staten Island named Scott Carlin. Marissa Tomei plays his mom, Margie Carlin, and then Bill Burr plays a man named Ray Bishop. I'll get into the plot in a second. First, a little spoiler alert. I'm going to just tell you the plot. Secondly, the movie is rated R due to some drug use, language, and some sexual scenes. So just keep that in mind if you're going to watch it and or recommend it. Here's the basic plot. It's a coming-of-age story. So Pete Davidson plays the main character, and based on what I've read, it's a kind of semi-autobiographical story about him coming of age in Staten Island. It's also kind of hero's journey. Are you familiar with Joseph Campbell's the stages of the hero's journey? It's kind of like the monomyth, the archetype of the story that every single one of us is interested in. How do I leave my comfortable life, engage the challenges that are present before me, and then become something greater so that I can be of greater value and worth to my community? So that's the story. What makes it so delightful are the details of the story. The comfortable place where Scott is at the beginning of the movie is he's in his 20s and he's living in his mom's house. His dad has been deceased for something like 17 years, a deceased fireman, and it's kind of your classic like Oedipal stuck in mom's basement story. His sister has her life together and she's headed off to college. And he's basically a giant adolescent. He's doing drugs in the house. He has a very superficial relationship with his girlfriend. He loves giving tattoos, but frankly, he's a total amateur. And what makes it interesting is he's very aware of his own inadequacies. And throughout the first part of the movie, he says frequently, when people say, like, can you get on with your life here? He basically says, no, I'm a screw up. I can't do it. And he has great excuses. He had never had a dad. His mom has her problems. She's having a hard time moving on. She has a shrine to her dead husband from 17 years ago. So everyone's kind of stuck. And where the plot starts to move is Scott is out with his smoking buddies on the beach, and this little kid comes out, like, I don't know, 9 years old or so. And Scott tries to give him a tattoo. And of course, the kid wants the tattoo. And the kid's like, give me the tattoo. And he starts tattooing, and the kid starts screaming, and he runs off. The kid's dad shows up at Margie's house. And he says, your grown son, tried to give a tattoo to my 9-year-old boy. And, it's just this terrible situation. It shows how unbelievably bad Scott's judgment is, how he's just really incapable of being a grown-up, of engaging the world, and now he's hurting a kid. I mean, it's just a disaster. But what happens is that man turns out to be a firefighter, starts courting Scott's mom. They start a relationship. That is the catalyst is Scott starts to move. A whole series of kind of funny events. He's outside of his house. His mom kicks him out. Good job, Mom. And he starts kind of volunteering, so to speak, at the fire department. He starts to learn how to do simple tasks of service. Ray Bishop asks Scott to take his little kids to school. And so Scott, all tattooed up, starts walking these little kids to school. He's starting to learn how to serve. In that sense, he's starting to come of age. But the climax of the story happens when a man shows up at the fire department, fire station, and he's been shot. And all the firemen are out putting out a fire, so Scott steps up, and he takes this guy to the ER, actually where his mom is. She's a nurse. Ray Bishop shows up, and what happens is Scott's mom sees that Ray let Scott tattoo his back. Now that's a big deal, and I'll get to that why in just a little bit. The movie ends with a final act of service where Scott takes his girlfriend on a ferry where she's going over to New York to interview for a job. so that she can, I think, be a city planner, come back in order to get an education and come back and try to make Staten Island a better place. And the movie ends as she goes in to take her test. Scott walks out. He says, "I'll wait for you as you take your test." And he's looking up at the beautiful, majestic, promising New York skyline, which symbolizes that he is now ready to take on the world. He's become adequate. He's become the hero ready to take on the world. Why does it matter? Why is it worth talking about, especially for me as a priest and from a Catholic perspective? I just want to say two things. One from a philosophical perspective, one from a theological perspective, and the two go together. There was a great Catholic philosopher by the name of Gabriel Marcel in the early 20th century, really worth reading. And what I also have found so fascinating about his writings is the way he unfolds the mystery of what it means to be a man/father. And to some degree, every man is called to be a father. Here's why. For Gabriel Marcel, to be a father is to recognize this huge gap between you and others, especially your own children, right? Imagine the closeness of a mom to her children from the moment they're conceived and born. And there's the father recognizing there's this huge gap. These kids don't even know me. I'm daddy. They cry when I hold them. And that dynamic, it goes for a father's whole life. That abyss, or chasm, Gabriel Marcel called it, creates a danger. The father can disengage, never become a father, or he can make what Marcel calls a creative vow, by which he leaps across the chasm and chooses to be the father, which means that not for his own ego, but for simply the good of the child, he will allow himself to be the father. And that creates a kind of wound or mark. It marks the man. It's painful for him to do that. It creates a kind of spiritual scar. But in that voluntary scarring through this creative vow, I will be your father, you will be my son or daughter, the man comes to a kind of maturity. Now, do you see why this movie embodies that? Scott shouldn't be out tattooing little kids, right? He should be allowing himself to be tattooed, to be marked out of love for others, with whom he even has a huge gap. But where does he learn that? He has to see it done for him. But he lost his father, so who's going to teach him how to receive the wound of the creative vow? Ray Bishop. Ray Bishop. Now, I don't know if his last name is Bishop on purpose, but that means like an overseer, right? Someone who's responsible for another. And so Ray lets him tattoo on his back. And what does he tattoo on his back among all sorts of other funny symbols? But the image of Ray and Scott, his sister, and his mom. In other words, relationships. Imprinted into Ray's flesh. And in that, Scott now has seen, in Ray's willingness to be tattooed, Scott has seen what it means to really be a man, to let yourself be wounded out of love for others, to make that creative vow. That's the philosophy, right? It's true not just of men, it's true of every human person. I'll voluntarily let myself be wounded out of love for another, not for my own ego, but simply in an altruistic act of love for the good of the other. That's what Scott's learning in the movie, and the tattoo is an image of that. That's the philosophy of it. Here's the theology of it. In the prophet Isaiah, it's chapter 49, verse 16, God says through the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, I have you carved in the palm of my hand." And any Jewish person would know what that means. God is saying, I'm in a covenant with you. I've cut you into my very flesh. Now, of course, God doesn't have a hand in his own divine nature. It's a metaphor for I've tattooed you. God has jumped across this chasm or abyss through the creative vow of his covenant with Abraham and Israel. That's what is fulfilled in Jesus. Now think of the covenant of the cross. It's the new covenant where the Son of God himself takes our human flesh and allows his flesh, yes indeed, to be cut, to be marked. And that's what Jesus shows when he rises from the dead. You're carved into the palm of my hand. I've suffered out of love for you to show you the way to full maturity. Think of Jesus saying to the apostles, rejoice that your names are written in heaven. And through the cross, in some ways, our names are written into the very flesh of Jesus. So in that sense, Jesus is the image of the true father, the true bishop. He's the true Ray Bishop. And I think a sign of Christian maturity, whether we're a man or a woman, is to allow the names of those to whom we're sent to serve to be written into metaphorically into our very bodies, into our very flesh, through our willingness to suffer and be in covenant relationship with each other. You think of it, the church as that great family where people are responding to that, the covenant that God has made with us, in which we learn how to become fully mature and how to become heroes, a little bit like Scott Carlin. Thanks for joining me.